Hello. Thank you for the follow, Ivy Scythe, by the way. You're not going to be in chat? That's all good. Thanks for showing up, Mallory. I hope everyone had a great Christmas. Oh, we're one away from 40 followers on Twitch. That's exciting. Gosh, that's really exciting. Yes, excuse the long silence. I'll be there as soon as I can. I'm just doing the appropriate shares and all that good stuff. Trying to do some little promotional materials. You know how it goes. Let's see. We're gonna go... There we go. Okay, we're almost there. We're almost there. Don't worry, I'll be right on. Okay. There we go. We're here. We're ready. It's time to go. Woo! Trying to get myself hyped up because I know I'm about to be heartbroken. It's fine though. It's fine. Everything's fine. I'll do fine, you know? Apparently now is when the fic is like really supposed to be getting intense, and I stopped right before the intense part. So I'm just a little bit intimidated about that, and by a little bit I mean a lot. But we'll be fine, you know? It's gonna be fine. Streaming, let's do good old Twitter. Here we go. I'm so bad at social media. For somebody who's like trying to make it on social media, I'm not the best at it, but we're doing our best, and that's all that matters, right? That's right. Okay. Now to close these extra tabs. Perfect. All right. Let's take the starting soon screen off and pull up the one with my face. Hello. Today's outfit is a bit of a mess. I couldn't decide between a flower crown or my little dragon onesie. I wanted to be cozy because I was afraid. I also have a little dragon plush friend, a little dragon squishmallow here to give me emotional support. But you know, it'll be fine. I also have my tea. Last time I had to stop early because my voice was giving out on me, so hopefully some tea helps. Got some nice green tea with lemon to soothe the throat and the heart. But I'm excited to read more. I've missed reading for you guys, and I'm excited to see how this story ends up going. So if you'd give me a moment to pull up the correct chapter, then we will go. Let's see, we are on chapter 4, part 2. Let's see. Last I remember... Let's see. Last I remember, there was the Captain Puffy bit. Sapnap was in there, and he was so cool. I loved Sapnap's, like, bit. Hello, you found your post about this on Tumblr. Oh, awesome! Thanks so much! I appreciate it. I hope you enjoy sitting around and reading, or I hope you enjoy my reading. I've been having a lot of fun reading this, but I have a feeling the fun is about to end. Let's see. I'm trying to do a summary of where I'm at. The last I remember was Captain Puffy. Sapnap showed up for a little bit, and I got all excited because he's my boy. But yeah, I'm really excited to pick back up where we left off. And also, if you like what you see, feel free to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. But no pressure, obviously. I hope you like what you see. We'll start up a little bit before where we dropped off last time, just so I can get back into the groove. So we're reading chapter 4 of Passerine, and we're starting out right about in the middle. Alright, here we go. Tea time. Make sure you have some water, something soft to snuggle with. Let's get to reading. Alright. The laughter was the worst of it. Wilbur could feel it growing louder in his head, the sound of 1,000 different voices laughing at a joke he was not privy to, a joke with him as the punchline. But then the still healing wound on his hand would ache, reminding him of what he'd done and where he was. He was standing on a rock, feet braced against moss, felling distant enemies with arrows. He was King Wilbur, protector of the realm, ruler of the kingdom, leader of the royal army, and he'd brought all these people here. And he was not going to let them down. He could spot Tommy's golden head below him, clearing out the enemies that slipped by Wilbur's shots. He was good. Frighteningly good. It was easy to forget how capable Tommy was at destruction. He was so used to seeing Tommy lose against Techno that he'd forgotten that against anyone else, Tommy was a force to be reckoned with all on his own. But that did not do much to dispel the worry tightening in Wilbur's gut. He was, after all, also an older brother. Tommy launched himself at an incoming enemy, spear out. The enemy swung with his sword, but Tommy ducked just in time and swept his leg out to knock the man over. Wilbur saw the spear pierce clean through, and the body was still twitching on the ground before Tommy was whirling around to pace another. This one did not get a meter near Tommy before Wilbur had put an arrow through their throat. Tommy whirled around and flashed Wilbur a grin. "Not bad, Archer boy!" Despite everything, Wilbur managed a small smile. A smile that slipped from his face when a sudden motion flickered in the corner of his vision. "Tommy, watch out!" Wilbur shouted, just as the enemy soldier barreled into Tommy. The two of them tumbled into the dirt, a tangle of limbs and blades. Wilbur fumbled for an arrow and found his quiver empty. "Shit," he thought. "Shit," the voices agreed happily. Wilbur hurriedly flung his bow over his shoulder and, in the same breath, unsheathed his twin rapiers from their scabbards. He dropped down from his perch, teeth rattling on impact, the pain not registering because Tommy's in trouble. The enemy soldier had Tommy pinned to the ground, a sword raised over his head and ready to drop. Tommy was thrashing, desperately reaching for the spear that had been knocked out of his hand, but Wilbur was already kicking the enemy violently off him. The enemy rolled across the ground, allowing Wilbur to stand between him and Tommy, the twin swords flashing menacingly in the flickering firelight. "Get the fuck away from my brother," he hissed. "How touching," the soldier said mockingly. He was different from the others. Wilbur could tell. He didn't know how, exactly, but he just was. His eyes and hair were as black as coal, in stark contrast to the blood-stained white cloak he wore around his shoulders. "You," Wilbur said, brows furrowing. "I saw you walk through the fire. How?" The man scoffed. "You think that little stunt could hurt me?" He raised his blade. Upon closer inspection, it looked to be made of pure obsidian, pitch black all the way down to the hilt. I was born in fire. Are you the leader of this army? Wilbur demanded. He gave a short bark of laughter. Me? No, I'm merely a pawn in this game. A pawn with a grudge to settle, but still a pawn nonetheless. He grinned. Now, show me what he taught you, King. Show me what he taught you, King. Wilbur didn't need to be told twice. He launched himself at the man, blue irises crunching beneath his feet. Their swords met, and from there it was a dance. Blades flashed as Wilbur began pushing the man backwards, but he was matching Wilbur hit for hit. Wilbur thrusted forward with his left sword, but the man dodged fluidly before swinging his sword in a mean arc that should have taken Wilbur's head clean off if he had not stepped backwards. From there, the man launched his offensive, striking from above, but Wilbur managed to cross his rapiers together and blocked the hit just in time. The blow reverberated down to Wilbur's bones, but the man gave him no time to recover, pushing his blade harder against Wilbur's. Wilbur dug his heels into the ground and parried, using the man's weight against him. He'd hoped it would cause the man to stumble and end this matter once and for all, but instead, the man swung again, feigning another overhead strike before changing to a side hit at the last moment. Wilbur blocked the blow, but the force of it sent him crashing to the ground. The white-cloaked soldier stood over him, a small smile playing on his lips. That was disappointing, he said, spinning his sword lazily between his fingers, as if he had all the time in the world. At the very least, I expected a man trained under a god of blood to, well, actually draw some. Wilbur froze. He glared up at the man standing before him, suddenly understanding. You're here for Techno. The man stopped spinning his sword. I'm surprised he told you what he is. You must meet along to him. His smile was slow and cold. That makes this all the more fun. He raised his sword and brought it crashing down. It might have been hours. It might have been days. It might even have been between the space of one breath and another. Technoblade could no longer tell. More and more of the enemy were finding ways to breach the wall of fire. The Royal Army's archers were doing their best to snipe them down before they could join the fray, but their dreadful lack of experience was beginning to show. Cracks were forming. They were nearing a breaking point. No, Techno thought, trident in one hand, bone-handled chain whip in the other. Not if I can help it. He found himself in the thick of it, drawn not to the violence but to the sound of Wilbur's people. His people, calling for help. A god's help. Blood, the voices demanded. Blood for the blood god. But Techno didn't want blood, not today. He wanted justice. Get down, he told the Royal Army soldiers that had gathered around him. Techno realized with a jolt that they had not come to him to ask for his protection, but to give him theirs. As if their fragile mortal bodies might make a difference when it came to him. Fools, he wanted to say, but all that came out was, on the ground, all of you, now. They were quick to comply. They dove into the weeds just as Techno lashed out with his whip. The heavy chain carved an arc through the air before finding its mark, wrapping around the neck of an enemy soldier. Techno pulled sharply, knocking the soldier down. He shook the whip free and spun it around to hit an oncoming enemy straight in the head. There was a sickening crunch as the force of the whip crushed bone. Before the body hit the ground, Techno spun the whip towards other targets, aiming for throats, temples, ankles, anything to pull or crush. He was standing in the eye of the storm, his whip cracking through the air like lightning. When the chain whip rattled back into his hands again, it was wet with blood. You can get up now, he told the soldiers that were staring dazedly up at him from the ground. Take care of the stragglers. What stragglers? One of them called out incredulously, but Techno was already moving again. He launched himself into the air, for a brief moment flying weightlessly over the carnage, and then he crashed down with his trident, impaling a man to the earth. He pulled the trident out with a sickening squelch and threw a throwing knife right into the eye of an approaching soldier. Another came running towards him, but he made quick work of them too. This was his element. This was where he belonged. More, the voices demanded. More, more, more! This was not his element. This was not where he belonged. He was under strict orders from the king himself to keep him in check. And he would not falter now. And then he heard it. Techno could not explain how he heard it over the sounds of swords clashing and people dying and fires burning. It was as if his very soul had only been listening for that sound and nothing else. In the far distance, a scream. When he was a child, Tommy had tried to scale the side of the castle. He did not remember the fall, but he remembered the crash. He remembered the feeling of his bones splintering beneath him, the pain so blinding he almost passed out. He didn't know who eventually found him, but he eventually woke up in his bedroom, his left arm in a sling and Wilbur asleep by his bedside. Techno had been leaning against the far wall, glaring at him. "He's been here for days," Techno had said. "You really scared the shit out of him, Tommy." It was the angriest Techno had ever been at him, and that was the moment Tommy understood what he really meant was that Tommy scared the shit out of both of them. As the white-cloaked man's sword broke through the shaft of Tommy's spear and into Tommy's shoulder, he remembered that pain, and felt it 1,000-fold. He felt the blade break through the skin and embed itself in his collarbone, and there was only fire in his veins. "Tommy!" He felt Wilbur's hand pulling him back, and they both stumbled backwards, Tommy still clutching the broken ends of the spear he'd tried to shield Wilbur with. Tommy fell to his knees, the pain making everything go white. "I'm going to pass out," he thought. "I'm going to die." "Little hero," the man grumbled as he approached them once again, the edge of his sword dripping with Tommy's blood. "You're only delaying the inevitable. Now sit still as I put you down." "Tommy." Wilbur's hands were on him, pressing against his wound. Tommy, come here. I'll fix you. Wilbur," Tommy croaked as the white-cloaked man advanced. "Wilbur, the enemy." "Say your goodbyes, princeling," the man cackled, raising his sword one final time. Tommy grabbed Wilbur, even as his entire body trembled with the movement, covering his older brother's body with his own. He shut his eyes, waiting for the coup de grace. It never came. When Tommy looked back again, he found Technoblade standing over them, blocking the man's sword with his trident. "Finally," the man growled, pushing against the shaft of Techno's trident. "I've been waiting for you, you bloody bastard." Techno cocked his head to the side, considering the man at length. He said monotonously, "don't fucking know you." The man's eyes hardened. "You killed them. You took them both away from me, and you don't even remember!" He jumped back, cutting the air between them with his sword, splattering the ground by Techno's feet with Tommy's blood. "That's all right. I'll just make you remember." Techno turned to look at Tommy and Wilbur, his expression carefully neutral. He took in Tommy's wound, Wilbur still frantically trying to suppress the blood flow. "Techno," Tommy breathed. Techno's jaw clenched. "Go." He turned back to his enemy, his braid whipping in the wind. Most of the morning glories were gone. "Take care of your brother, Wilbur." "What?" "Tommy, let's go," Wilbur said sharply. He began to pull Tommy over to the mossy rock he'd been standing on. He leaned Tommy against it and bent to the task of securing the gash in Tommy's shoulder. Wilbur ripped the end of his red and blue coat and began wrapping it around Tommy's shoulder. "I can't see, Wilbur," Tommy protested, straining to look beyond Wilbur's head. "You don't need to see that," Wilbur insisted grimly, tightening the cloth around the wound. "You don't want to see that." "See what?" Tommy demanded, his throat aching. When had he started screaming? "Wilbur, we need to help him!" Before Wilbur could reply, there was a loud crack like thunder, making them both flinch. Wilbur turned towards the sound, just enough for Tommy to catch a glimpse of the fighting over his shoulder, just enough for him to see Technoblade raise the man up by his collar and drive him straight into the ground, shattering the earth once more. He was supposed to be dead. As Technoblade drove him against the earth with enough force to crack it, he knew the man should have died from the first time around. But he didn't. Instead, he merely grinned up at Technoblade with bloody teeth, his face drawn and cold, and much to Techno's chagrin, completely earned arrogance. "Ah, I see," Techno said with his hand around the man's throat. "What's a god of war doing in a place like this?" "I would state the obvious," the man said calmly, gesturing to the bloodbath around them, "but this is a purely personal affair." He kicked up, landing a hit to Techno's gut that launched him backwards. Techno braced himself against the dirt, unwilling to give the war god any more ground. Tommy and Wilbur were somewhere behind him, and that was all the reason Techno needed to pick up his trident again. The war god got unsteadily to his feet, then seemed merely to shake himself out of the experience of having his head cracked against the ground with the force of 20 rampaging bulls. He cracked the tension out of his neck and simply picked up his sword again. "Now that we're properly acquainted," the war god said, "let's take this more seriously, shall we?" He moved quicker than Techno expected. Techno barely managed to parry a blow aimed directly at his heart. Techno thrust out with his trident in retaliation, but the war god simply danced out of the way before returning again in full force. Techno took one of the knives from his bandolier and stabbed out, managing to nick the other god, just barely, before they clashed weapons again. Blow for blow, hit for hit. They could have gone on like that forever. a god of war and a god of blood. In another life, they might have been allies. Techno tried in vain to remember which of the many people he'd felled over the centuries had belonged to this man, but there were too many. A long line of ghosts he would spend the rest of his immortal life atoning for. Atoning? The voices laughed. What is there to atone for? Does a lion atone for killing the gazelle? Does the fire atone for burning? Techno jumped backwards and threw his knife, which the war god deflected easily with his sword. He threw another, which the war god dodged. Another, which stuck harmlessly into the earth. Techno reached for another and found his bandolier empty. This is futile, the war god said. Just put down your weapons and maybe I'll give you the merciful death you never gave them. You fight and you struggle, but we both know how this ends. Mortals and their bloody games. There can only be one outcome, right? The war isn't over yet, Technoblade replied. The god of war smiled, his eyes drifting into something over Techno's shoulder. Are you sure about that? Techno looked behind him, his eyes finding Tommy and Wilbur first, crouched underneath a rock. Techno could not bring himself to linger on the look of fear on Tommy's face as he stared back at him, so he continued searching the horizon for what had caught the war god's attention. His heart, what remained of it, sunk as he took in the thousands of enemy reinforcements flooding into the Blue Valley. Oh no. No! It's a Tubbo section. This might actually get me. Uh-oh. Tubbo stood in the knee-depth waters of the river that cut through the valley. Once clear, it now ran red with blood. Friend or foe, it didn't seem to matter. They all bled the same. The river's current was tugging at him. It's all right, it seemed to say. You can let go now. And Tubbo wanted to. By gods, he wanted to, more than anything. His quiver was empty of arrows. He'd lost his bow and sword in the chaos. All he had now was a dagger, its blade no longer than his hands and just as frail. His body felt like it had been fighting for weeks, but at a glance the sun high overhead told him it had only been hours. Hours of senselessly slaughtering his way through the fray. It was better when he still had arrows, when he could stand and shoot at distant enemies without thinking of them as people, when he'd resorted to using a sword, when he'd gotten close enough to see the fear in their eyes as his blade pierced through cloth and skin, when the blood had colored him crimson. It was suddenly frighteningly real. Once, he'd wanted to see their enemies burn. Now, he just wanted it to be over. Tubbo looked up at the sound of shouting. Before him, enemies were running through the wall of flames, cutting through the fire like one after the other in an unending tide. The words reinforcements and too many and retreat echoed in Tubbo's ears as the breath was knocked out of him. He tightened his grip on his dagger, and they grew closer, an infinite army. Tubbo felt bile rise in his throat. Too many, too many, too many. He felt hot tears slipping down his cheeks. Too many, too many. He felt his fear and dread like a physical weight, almost driving him to his knees. Too many. In the end, Tubbo was not a hero, but he raised his dagger anyway. It's over, Tommy whispered. He leaned against his brother as they both looked over the valley, at the enemies descending upon their army like a swarm of hawks. The pain in his shoulder was now a distant worry. It wouldn't kill him, but he knew death was coming for him regardless. We're fucked. Wilbur was very still. Wilbur. Tommy turned to look at his brother. You know I love you, right? The king gave him a sharp look. What the hell are you talking about? Tommy swallowed thickly, trying and failing to keep the tears in. I love you. I don't think I ever said it, but it's true. I figured if it's my last chance... This is not your last chance, Wilbur snapped, his eyes darkening. He whirled around, facing Technoblade, who still stood between them and the mysterious soldier. Techno! Techno glanced back at Wilbur, his expression shuddered. He did not look at Tommy. It's time, Wilbur called out. For a moment, Techno only stared, and then slowly, deliberately, he nodded. I'm sorry, Wilbur. What? Tommy demanded. What are you two talking about? Wilbur did not reply. He wasn't even listening. Tommy could only watch as Wilbur unhooked a blowing horn from his side. He put it up to his lips mechanically, his eyes blank and staring at nothing at all. Wilbur, Tommy begged. Wilbur, what's going... Wilbur blew the horn. She heard it. They all did. Head snapped up at the sound of a war horn echoing through the valley, a low, sad sound like the beginnings of a funeral dirge or the cry of a lone bird separated from its flock. The flower shopkeeper met the eyes of a woman across the field, a stranger, only familiar from brief and consequential meetings at the camp. But in that moment, they were kindred spirits, united in their determination. The shopkeeper nodded. The woman gave her a solemn salute. It was now or never. The shopkeeper glanced at the oncoming horde of enemies, butchering all that stood in their way. But the royal army was not fighting anymore. No, they were running. They threw down their weapons and ran back in the direction of the hill, stumbling over weeds and irises and vines of morning glories. The Green Army, outnumbering them 10-1, gave chase, unaware of what was coming. The shopkeeper took off, the rock in her pocket seeming to grow heavier with every step. But unlike the others, she was headed north, up one of the craggy mountains that bordered the valley. She knew the others, at least those who weren't dead already, must be headed towards the other mountain, crouching through the trees and underbrush like she was. There were 50 of them in total, but only 2 of them were really needed for the job. "If you lose heart," the king had said during the midnight meeting where he'd laid out their plans to the volunteers, "just make sure someone else still has theirs. This is a last resort, but it might also be our only chance." He'd told them all they were free to leave. None of them had. The rest of camp had been told 2 things. When you hear the horn, run for your life, and don't tell Prince Tommy. The shopkeeper bounded over boulders and overgrowth, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. "Hey!" She risked a glance back and found 3 Green Army soldiers running after her. They were less used to the terrain than she was. She walked this path a million times over the past week, but they were gaining on her quick, and their swords were raised and ready. The shopkeeper kept running, but her knees were screaming, her lungs on the verge of collapse. She was tired. So tired. A yell came from behind her. She tried to ignore it until it came again. She glanced behind her once more, stopping dead in her tracks when she realized what was happening. One of the enemy soldiers was on the ground, a small dagger embedded into the nape of his neck. The other 2 were doubling back, facing the attacker that must have followed them up to the forest. She caught sight of brown hair, a small frame. Oh, gods. It was the boy who lied his way into the army, and had fought bravely in it until the very end. The shopkeeper glanced behind her to the cave where her main objective was. She was so close! But the boy, she saw, was unarmed. The decision was already made. She ran back down the mountain, her axe in her hand. The soldiers had cornered the boy against the tree, their blades ready to cut at his life at 17 years. But that meant their backs were to her, and they never saw her coming. "Just pretend you're chopping down a tree," the general had taught them during their training phase at the castle. "The axe will get the job done, but it'll take a few swings." It only took her 2, one through the neck, the other through the skull. The 2 soldiers dropped dead at her feet. The boy stared up at her, breathing heavily, his face streaked with blood and dirt. It looked as if he'd aged 50 years in a day. The shopkeeper no longer recognized the young, foolhardy boy who'd run around camp, doing the most menial chores, grinning from ear to ear, taking pride in being part of something bigger than himself. He was battered and bruised and bleeding, with eyes so haunted the shopkeeper couldn't help but wonder about all the things he'd seen since the sun rose over the battlefield. "What has the world done to you?" she thought. But all she said was, "Are you all right?" The boy could only nod wordlessly. "You need to get out of here," she said hurriedly, already hearing more soldiers coming up the mountain. "Here, take this." She shoved her axe into his hands. The boy shook his head vigorously. "I can't," he croaked. "You need to protect yourself." She gave him a bitter smile. "Trust me, kid. You need it more than I do. Now go. You know your orders. Back to the camp. Follow the sun." Before she could think better of it, she pulled the boy into her arms, hugging him tightly. For a moment, he could only stand in listless surprise, and then she felt his arms close around her. He buried his head into her shoulder and let out a single gut-wrenching sob. When the shopkeeper let go, there was a new spark in the boy's eyes. Faint, but better than nothing. The boy turned to go, but he lingered at the tree line. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nikki," she said. "My name is Nikki." "I'll see you later, Nikki," the boy said, and was gone. She stared after him for a while, her heart feeling lighter in ways she could not explain, but then a twig broke in the distance, heralding the arrival of enemy troops. The shopkeeper steeled herself one last time and headed for the cave. Inside, stacked from one end of the cave to the other, connected a natural underground caverns that ran the length of the mountains, was the king's last resort, the only thing that stood between their kingdom and certain doom. We will see our enemies burning, the king had promised them on that day, lifetimes ago. It wasn't exactly burning, but blowing them to Kingdom It wasn't exactly burning, but blowing them to Kingdom Come was an acceptable compromise. The flint was in her hand. All she could of irises. Her pursuers were at the mouth of the cave, screaming as they realized what she was about to do. They might have begged, but she would never know. I'll see you all in hell, she said bitterly, and struck the flint into flame. At the summit of the opposite mountain, in a cave almost identical, the captain did the same. For my kingdom, she whispered to the empty cave, and let the fire fall. Nikki hoped, at the very least, that they would plant the prettiest flowers over her grave. The explosions rocked the world. It rattled the very sun from its loyal orbit. Wilbur braced himself against the rock he'd once stood fearlessly on and watched the mountains fall. Yes, the voices chorused. This was always meant to be. Wilbur had been here before. He'd dreamt it. He'd lived it. As an avalanche, the voices, the screaming, the blasts that went on and on and on. Flocks of birds soared up into the sky, disturbed from their perches. They were the only survivors. When the dust settled, all Wilbur could see was a pile of devastation from where the Blue Valley used to be. Their enemies crushed by the thousands or buried alive on Wilbur's orders, and their allies. Wilbur bent over the ground and vomited. Wilbur. Wilbur's ears were still ringing. He heaved the last of his stomach's contents, coughing up blood and spittle. There was no end to it. Wilbur! Wilbur turned, almost afraid of what he would find behind him. Tommy, his face pale, his eyes wide and staring, as if he had never seen Wilbur before. Tommy? Wilbur croaked. Stop looking at me like that. Look away. Look away. Look away. What? Tommy's voice was so small. What the fuck did you just do? What the fuck did he just do? The war god demanded. He tried moving towards the king in his way. Don't take another step. Techno raised his trident, its prongs aimed towards the war god's chest. Your army's gone. There's nothing left to fight for. You bastard, the god growled, his obsidian sword trembling in his grip. You think this hurts? Blood for the blood god. I shall kill you again. The war god jumped toward him, starting the cycle anew. You said no more secrets. Tommy's nails dug bloody crescents into his palm. You promised, Wilbur. They were all dead. They were all dead because of the man that Tommy couldn't bear to call his brother. He wanted to dig into his skin and rip out every part that was Wilbur's. He wanted to gut himself, tear it all apart from the inside out, if that was what it took to get rid of the screaming in his head. Wilbur wasn't meeting his eyes. Tommy marched up to him and grabbed him roughly by the collar. Fucking look at me, you piece of shit! Tommy screamed. The ground was still shaking, or maybe it was just him. Hot tears spilled down his cheeks, tears of a rage too big for his body. How long have you been planning this? Was it from the beginning? Did you look our people in the eyes and never bothered telling them you were leading them to the slaughterhouse? Some of them had to have survived, Wilbur whispered, his words almost lost to the wind. I warned them. Tommy shook him violently. That's not the fucking point, he sobbed. Wilbur finally looked at him, but there was nothing behind his dark eyes. I did what I had to do, Tommy, he said. Tommy shoved him viciously away. His hands felt dirty. He felt unclean. In his head, he could still hear the strings of a lonely guitar, playing over the soft laughter of soldiers that were now simply gone. Gone in a flash, between one breath and the next. It had come so easily to Wilbur. Would it come easily to Tommy, too? You fucked up, Tommy spat. You fucked up, Wilbur. Tommy, Wilbur reached out for him, but Tommy flinched back. Don't fucking touch me! In battle, when two opponents were evenly matched, in strength, in wisdom, in anger, it would only take one thing to bring it all down. One soul he'd lost everything, because a blood god had decided to throw his lot in with the opposing forces. One soldier. Afterwards, the war god had dragged himself through the battlefield, his throat burning from screaming his lover's name into the quiet sky. When he'd found him, the war god had crawled towards his broken body, curling around it as if he could somehow warm it back to life. And he'd stayed there for years, for the two of them. He would have stayed there forever, besides the carcass rotted down to the bones, but a fire had grown inside him, a fire that would not be satiated until he had the head of a god that had taken everything from him. Now here he was, facing off against the very culprit. It was a bloody dance. The war god slashed and the blood god parried. The blood god lunged and the war god ducked, like the push and pull of the tides, drawn to each other by a gravity of violence. But all the war god needed, he knew, was a single chance. He would not waste it. "Don't fucking touch me!" The words were the high-pitched shriek of a frightened child, a familiar sound on the battlefield, indistinguishable from every scream that came before it. But the blood god turned towards it, leaving his defenses completely open. One mistake. The war god raised his sword high above his head. It was very difficult to kill a god, but not impossible. In the right hands, like the hands of a warrior with fire in his heart and carnage in his smile, it would only take one blow. "Goodbye, blood god," he thought. "My vengeance is complete." Technoblade turned instinctively at Tommy's scream, just in time to see Tommy draw back from Wilbur's reaching hands. Pain flashed across Wilbur's face, but he was otherwise unscathed. Both of them were safe, no knives in their backs, no arrows to their throat. A shadow fell over Technoblade, and by the time he remembered where he was, it was too late. Technoblade turned and faced the tip of a bloody sword, a breath away from his face. But it was not the war god's obsidian blade coming to reap his soul. It was a familiar silver broadsword pierced right through the war god's chest. Technoblade could only stare as the war god looked down at the blade embedded straight through his heart, his sword arms raised in what would have been a killing blow. Instead, the obsidian sword fell harmlessly out of his limp hold and onto the dirt, and the war god followed close behind, his golden hair catching the rays of the setting sun. "No!" the voices screamed. "Not you! Not you! Not you!" "Hello, Techno," said Philza. Sorry, I need a minute. Oh my gosh. Tea and water for this. Wilbur saw a marionette with his strings suddenly cut. "Dad?" Their father was standing before Techno in the unmoving body of the white-cloaked soldier. At the sound of Tommy's voice, he turned and looked at his sons for the first time in a decade. "And so he enters the scene once more," the voices whispers. And before Wilbur could say anything, Tommy was already running. One move, that was all it would take. On the ground beside him was one of the blood god's throwing knives, lost during their battle. With the last of his strength, he curled his fingers around the hilt. His love was calling him home. He could hear it in the warm wind, but he could not face him before he was avenged. And so, with all he had left, the war god aimed and threw. "Dad!" His father was here, his dad, standing among the blue irises, the same shade as his sad eyes. The years fell away like smoke, and Tommy was a boy again. There was no explosion. There was no war. There was no leaving. There was only a son and his father. Tommy felt a hysterical laugh bubble out of him as he ran, even as his cheeks still stung with tears. There was everything. There was confusion, there was grief, there was anger, there was relief, there was disbelief, there was joy. "Dad!" Tommy shouted, spreading his arms as wide as he ran, like a bird about to take flight. "Tommy." Dad's smile was still the same after all these years. He opened his arms, welcoming Tommy into an embrace. "My boy, you've grown so much." And then there was pain, as the knife found its mark in the prince's heart. Techno watched Tommy fall backwards, impossibly slow. It took a moment for the reality to sink in, and by then, Wilbur was screaming. Screaming so loud it drowned out everything else, even the voices that began screeching inside Techno's head. "Tommy!" "Tommy!" Philza shouted, running towards Tommy's unmoving body, but Wilbur was already there, cradling his brother to his chest. Techno could only watch, utterly numb, utterly cold, utterly lost inside his own head. No, this could not be happening. It was over. The war was over. He'd done everything he could to protect them, to protect Tommy. Why was this still how it ended? "This is what it feels like," someone gasped. "To lose everything." By the time Techno turned toward the war god, ready to rip him limb from fucking limb, he was dead, a smile on his face. "Fuck you," Techno thought furiously. Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. Techno! Wilbur scream brought him violently back into his body with the force of a comet crashing into Earth. Help me! Techno staggered towards them, his blood heavy as lead, his vision hazy, but he could see the one thing that mattered. His Tommy, lying so still in his brother's arms. His Tommy, who braided his hair with sweet-smelling flowers. His Tommy, who was quick to anger but quicker to laugh. His Tommy. The sun was setting over the blue valley. There was a terrible, terrible silence. The kind of silence that always came before something devastating. The calm before the storm. Tommy had always hated silences. It gave his mind too many spaces to fill with darkness. So he brought light instead. Noise and laughter and jokes and jibes. Anything to keep the quiet at bay. Wilbur had helped with the weight, like he promised, but now it was back, pressing against Tommy's chest, suffocating him under his burden. There was pain, so much pain. He thought he'd already felt pain, but what did he truly know? He was only 15. Tommy felt himself lifted into someone's arms, the arms of the man that had snuffed out the lives of 2 armies in one fell swoop. Tommy wanted to push him away again, to spit his anger and disgust, but he was too weak to do either. He could only lie there, staring up at his brother's face, twisted with anguish. His mouth was moving, speaking words Tommy could barely hear. Let me go, Tommy wanted to say. Give me back to the ground. But then Wilbur started humming. It was a song. The song. The song Tommy had been humming just this morning, lifetimes ago. What? Tommy breathed, the rest of the question dying on his lips. He couldn't even keep his eyes open. He should. He knew he should, because otherwise he'd be... Your lullaby, Wilbur sobbed, his tears hitting Tommy's cheeks. It's the lullaby I used to play for you on my guitar when you were younger. And just like that, everything that came before was forgiven and forgotten and... gone. But was that such a bad thing? Rest would be nice. If it meant his lungs would stop hurting. If it meant his chest would stop aching. Sleep. Sleep was good. Sleep was... I miss your music, Wilbur. Tommy could feel someone stroking back his hair gently, so lovingly. Keep your eyes open, Tommy. Techno. Keep your God's damned eyes open. Bad. He needed to keep awake. Techno was telling him to, and Tommy always did what Techno said, because Techno was his tutor, his teacher, his big brother. I would've... Tommy coughed. He felt blood trickle down his jaw, then nothing at all. I would have liked to hear you play together again. Wilbur's hold on him tightened. Somewhere far away, someone was screaming for a medic, and Tommy knew. Tommy knew it was... We'll play for you, Techno vowed. When we get home, we'll play for you as many times as you want, Tommy. I'll let you beat me when we spar. I'll let you braid my hair. Or even cut it all off if you want to. Anything. Just keep your eyes open. A shadow fell over them, in the shape of wings that Tommy had only seen once before, when he had flown out of Tommy's bedroom window and out of their lives forever. Or, not forever. Tommy tried to raise his head, to see his father's face, but the pain was too much. Dad, Tommy whispered. He still wanted to do so much. He still wanted to scream at Wilbur and then embrace him. He wanted to find flowers for Techno's hair. He wanted to go home, to the kingdom they had protected. He still wanted to hug his dad. But a darkness was quickly gathering. Tommy? Tommy had no idea who said his name. It all sounded so very far away. Don't leave me, Tommy begged. Please, I'm so scared. We're here, Tommy. A kiss on his forehead. Someone holding his hand. Strong arms around him. Wilbur humming his old lullaby. Warmth, even in the dark. Too late. Thank you, Tommy breathed. Thank you. He had so much left to say. So much left to offer. Love, forgiveness, cheer. But he would leave it there until he woke up again. Tommy's eyes drifted shut. His mother's laughter had never sounded clearer. Somewhere in the distance, the green god began to smile. Woo! Oh my gosh! Wow! Oh my gosh. Welcome, Ivy Scythe, by the way. Nobody in this fic wins. Thank you so much for the support. Oh my gosh. Wow. I think this might be my favorite chapter so far. Wow. I'm sorry. I need a minute. I'm gonna start the next chapter soon, but I need just like a minute. That is... It's so good, but also so sad. Oh my gosh. Dude. Oh, I love how they, like, integrate the different characters and things like that. Like, that's amazing, but also, like, heartbreaking. Oh, man. Wow. That's... Oh, wow. Oh, man. Best chapter so far, but also the most heartbreaking. My gosh. They've shared their Twitter. I'm gonna go tweet at the author of this really quick. Because... Oh my gosh. I'm like... Anyway, chat, how are you doing? How was your Christmas? We're gonna take a little break for myself to, like, recover. Man, that chapter is good. We'll start very, very soon for the next chapter. Oh my gosh. It's gorgeous, but it really hurts. It really is. It, like, it hits different, man. I love fics like that, where it's like, the way that the author integrated all the characters is my favorite. Like, adding Sapnap as, like, Sapnap as, like, the god of war, and, like, the whole, like, oh my gosh. Oh, wow. Didn't the author also write a Dream Team fic, like, in the same universe? 'Cause I'm definitely gonna read that after this. Maybe not on stream, but I am definitely gonna read that, because I love their characterization of the Dream Team. Or, I mean, of Sapnap. And, like, putting in Tubbo, like, how dare you, first of all, but also thank you, and, like, Nikki, and, like, everything. Bills are coming back! Oh, man! Wow. Wow. Good stuff, but also... Ouch! Okay. We're gonna take some more swigs of tea here. Help us recover. Almost done with this tea. How's chat doing? Does everybody have water? I hope so. Gotta stay hydrated. So important. But yes. Okay. Let's go on to the next chapter, huh? Shrike, a prequel to Passerine. Oh my gosh! I have to read it, dude. Is it because Passerine's based on that one song? Is Shrike based on that Hosier song? Because I love that song too. They're just hitting all my buttons. You read it and it's just as good. Should I read it on stream? Nay? Do you say it nay? Should I read it on stream? Because I feel like that might be fun. People don't talk as much about the sequel, but I'd definitely be down. Let's see. Oh, it's based off of Shrike. Oh my gosh. Well, then I have to read it now. Because it has song I like in it. Obviously. It has song I like in it. I must read it now. It's still ongoing. Then I might just, after we finish this one, I might just keep reading this one on stream, huh? Alright, well. I feel like I've recovered enough. Let's start chapter 5, eh? First we're going to change the stream name, though. Update titles, Passerine chapter 5. And make sure it updates. Chapter 5. Pray for me. Okay. Passerine chapter 5. Pushing the spear into your side again and again and again. Dead. He's dead. He's dead and gone forever. The voices were screaming, clawing against the walls that Techno had set around them and tried to maintain for years. All for Wilbur. All for Tommy. And now one of them was dead, and the other was dying. There was no doubt about it. Wilbur would not survive this, and neither would Techno. or conversations, counting sins, and coming to terms with the cost of being a brother. Alright, we'll add our trigger warnings to the thingy. More death. You'll love to see it. Okay. He first held Tommy in a sunlit room. He had come earlier than expected, and was such a small thing, so much smaller than his brother had been. The midwives had told him there was a chance they could lose him within the hour, and his wife had cradled the newborn against her chest, sobbing against his pale skin. "My baby," she'd cried, "my little fighter. Be brave, Tommy. Be strong." But Tommy was so still in his mother's arms. Philza had stood at her bedside, watching her coo and cry at the baby who did not stir. He'd lived a million lives, and all its mysteries combined could not compare to the pain of being a mourner at his son's birthbed. And as the minutes churned on, heedless of the growing abyss inside his chest, he found that he could not even cry. It was a sadness too big for tears, a grief too infinite to measure. And when his wife had offered the baby to him, to give him his chance at saying goodbye despite her own despair, Philza did something he would never forgive himself for. He hesitated. He looked at the silent bundle in her arms, dead before he could even live, and felt the fracture in his heart grow. This was the fate of humanity, eventually. It did not matter if Tommy lived through the next year, or the next decade, or the next breath. He would still die one day. Bitter and numb and hateful to the world, Philza wondered if it were better that Tommy died now, before Phil could grow to love him more. People mourned the beauty of a wilting rose, but an unblooming bud would have a quieter heartache. But Tommy wasn't a flower. He was Tommy. He was Phil's son, and he loved him now as much as he could love him later, though later might never come. But his arms were made of stone. They would not rise as much as he willed them to. If he held Tommy now, he knew he would never let go. He would follow his baby to his grave. And then there he was, sneaking past the guards and the midwives, passing under a grieving god's notice. He climbed up into bed, smiling at his mother, apparently oblivious or immune, as often starry-eyed children were, to the anguish that coated the very air of the room. "Is this my brother?" Wilbur asked, leaning over the baby in his mother's arms. "May I hold him, Mother?" A lump formed in Phil's throat. He turned away before Wilbur could catch sight of his face, and when he turned back around, Wilbur had Tommy in the gentle crook of his arms. The sunlight slanted over them, and Phil wanted to remember them like that forever. His two beautiful sons, immortalized in gold. Wilbur's earth-brown curls hid his expression as he bent over the baby, murmuring something Phil almost didn't catch. And the baby began to cry. Wilbur pulled back, astonished, his face drawn in awe. "What is it?" he asked frantically. "Did I do something wrong?" Phil sobbed, falling to his knees before the three of them, his lovely laughing wife, his kind, bewildered Wilbur, and his loud, shrieking Tommy. "You did everything right, my boy. You're perfect." Now Wilbur held his brother, a baby no longer, but still so small, to his chest as they walked through the quiet, empty camp. Wilbur spoke the words he'd first spoken to his brother all those years before, over and over, like an enchantment or a prayer bringing him back to life once more. "I will love you forever. I will love you forever. I will love you forever." But this time, Tommy did not wake up, and Philza was still made of stone. He walked the ruins alone. Night had fallen, but the moon and stars were hidden by the heavy clouds cloaking the earth in darkness. The sky itself was in mourning. Tubbo moved through the gloom, a torch in his hand, creating shadows that seemed to reach out towards him like helpless ghosts. He stepped mindlessly over the rubble, his feet meeting dirt and stone, and sometimes the flesh of a fallen comrade, or an enemy, but did that matter anymore? That had not been as lucky as him. His ears were still ringing from the explosion, and his bones felt like a house of cards, one whisper away from collapsing, but he was alive. He was alive when all others were not. When the dust had settled and the survivors had come crawling out of the wreckage, Tubbo had counted. They had been warned, of course. They had heard the king's signal and ran as fast as they could, but not all of them were fast enough. The royal army had left the capital city with 20,000 soldiers. In the end, only 800 remained. Not all of them had been lost to the explosion. Most had already been dead by the time the mountains fell, slain by enemies and their cavalry. but the smell of sulfur still hung in the air like an accusation, following Tubbo as he made his rounds. He was meant to be looking for other survivors, but Tubbo had come to know a thing or two about lost causes. He could walk this valley for days, and all he'd find were the broken remains of 2 armies, a mass grave that would honor no one. In a century, people would walk this land again and see only green hills blooming with blue flowers. The prince was dead. That was what they were saying, killed in the final moments of the war, its last casualty. A month ago, Tubbo had watched the prince laugh on a balcony, his face lit from within. Now there was no light left anywhere. Overhead, the clouds broke open, and the heavens began to weep. It was raining outside. Techno could hear raindrops pounding against the roof of the tent and creeping through the cracks. But the boundless cold he felt was from something else entirely. He'd collapsed on the ground the moment they'd enter the tent, shivering with his arms around his knees, unable to feel anything beyond the relentless chill. It felt as if his bloodstream had frozen over, with brutal icicles stabbing into him from the inside out. And when he'd tried to duck his head into the dark embrace of his arms, a single blue petal had fallen against his skin. No, he'd ran his hands roughly through his hair, pulling pink strands out from the roots in his desperation to remove the last of the morning glories out of the tangles of his braid. Blood flowed from the places where his fingernails scraped against his scalp, but Techno found that he didn't care. He couldn't care. The whole world could burn around him, and all he would be thinking about were the flowers still caught in his hair, their saccharine scent like poison in his lungs. He clutched the flowers in his hands, blood-stained and trembling, and threw them as far as he could across the room, where they landed at the feet of the king. Wilbur sat at the cot his brother used to sleep in, clutching the broken boy to his chest. He was rocking back and forth, muttering words Techno could not comprehend as he pushed the hair back from Tommy's pale, unmoving face. Dead. He's dead. He's dead and gone forever, the voices were screaming, clawing against the walls that Techno had set around them and tried to maintain for years. All for Wilbur. All for Tommy. Now one of them was dead, and the other was dying. There was no doubt about it. Wilbur would not survive this, and neither would Techno. Blood, the voices demanded. Blood for the blood god. His hands curled into fists, so tightly his nails broke the skin of his palm. Blood trickled down his hands, but it would not be enough. He wanted a massacre. He wanted violent vengeance. And there was nothing and no one on the other side of his anger. All their enemies were dead. There was nowhere else to go but inward. Techno's knife was still lodged in Tommy's chest, in Tommy's heart. Your fault, the voices began. Blood follows you everywhere you go. Did you think you could outrun it? He thought he had. By gods, for once in his damned life, he thought he'd finally found somewhere safe. Somewhere no one knew his bloody past, or cared to. Somewhere with clear skies and a warm garden he could finally pretend to be something he could never be. Mortal. And now it all came crashing down around him. His farce, his naivete. This was the cost of those halcyon days. He should have left the first chance he got. He should have never met them at all. Wilbur. The name scratched his throat. He could barely hear himself speak. He tried again, putting as much strength in his words as there was left in him. Wilbur, let him go. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see Philza raise his head from his silent seat in the corner. He had not said a word since his arrival, not even as they marched back to the tent with Tommy's dead body between them. For once, Techno was glad for his silence. If he heard Philza's voice right now, he might just put his trident through the man's chest. Techno struggled to his feet when it was clear Wilbur was not listening to him. His legs threatened to collapse under his own weight, and he caught himself on the edge of the planning table, where wooden-carved soldiers still stood at attention for a war that was already over. It's all over. We need to fix him up, Wilbur, Techno said, his words coming out ragged. He staggered towards to Wilbur, hands outstretched. Wilbur's head snapped up at the sudden motion, his eyes wide and furious. Get away from us, he growled, pressing Tommy closer against himself. The movement made Tommy's head loll to the side, allowing Techno to truly see his face in the candlelight for the first time. Techno's breath hitched in his throat. Tommy looked so peaceful, as if he was simply sleeping, as if any moment now his eyes would flutter open and he'd grin up at the both of them, easily diffusing their tension as only Tommy could. Wake up, Techno begged, prayed, wished. Please wake up. But he never would again. You can't hold him forever, Techno spat. For God's sake, Wilbur, there's still a dagger in his chest. Wilbur looked down at the bundle in his arms, noticing the state of his brother for the first time. Absently, mechanically, he reached out to wipe a streak of dirt from Tommy's cheek. His expression grew incensed as the stubborn soil clung ferociously to his brother's skin, and Techno feared he might just wipe Tommy's flesh down to the bone. "Are you trying to peel him?" Techno demanded angrily. Wilbur looked up at him with a look of unbridled wrath, but did not reply. With a scoff, Techno took a stray piece of cloth hanging off the table and marched to the tent flaps. He drew them open and leaned out into the rain, catching the cold raindrops with the cloth until it was damp. Cold water slipped down his wrist, but it was a distant feeling, felt by another man in another time. When he turned back to them, Wilbur was still clinging to Tommy like a lifeline. "Let him go," Techno ordered. Wilbur shook his head silently, his shoulders trembling. "I can't." "Wilbur, I said I can't!" Wilbur stomped towards him until he was standing over Wilbur. "Of course you can. It's easy. Just open your damn arms and put him on the bed." Wilbur glared. "It would be easy for you, wouldn't it?" Techno narrowed his eyes at him. "What's that supposed to mean?" Cold. Everything was cold. Cold in his lungs, cold in his heart, cold in the very depths of his soul, if he still had one. Cold from the rain, cold from Tommy's skin, cold from Wilbur's damning eyes. Thunder cracked in the distance. It was going to be a long night. "It's easy," he'd said. "Just open your damn arms." Wilbur didn't know if he wanted to laugh or wail at Techno's words. There was nothing easy about anything anymore. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass, and every thought was a raging shriek. There was blood in his mouth from where he'd bitten the inside of his cheek just to keep himself from screaming, and by gods did he want to scream. He wanted to tear the whole world apart with his bare hands, burn and salt it, leave nothing behind, not even one whisper of what he once was. It did not deserve even the memory of Tommy. "You heard me," Wilbur hissed at the man standing before him, both of them glowering but not truly seeing each other. "Everything comes easy to you, doesn't it, blood god?" Techno's brows drew together in anger. "You don't get to throw that back in my face. Not tonight. Not after everything I did for you." Wilbur's arms trembled. He looked down at his brother's sleeping face. "Sleeping? Sleeping? He isn't sleeping. He's dead. Dead." With rattling breath, Wilbur traced the curve of Tommy's cheek, stopping where it used to dimple when he smiled. And then Wilbur looked down at where a knife still jutted out of his chest like a violent reminder. Fresh tears stung his eyes, and he tried desperately to drink them away before they could fall. And still a rebel tear found its way down his face, carving his dirty cheek in half. Death. Such a small word for such a big thing. Wilbur hadn't even wanted Tommy on the battlefield in the first place. He'd planned to leave Tommy at the castle where he would be safe behind walls in his own personal army of guards. But Techno, God's damned Techno, had talked him out of it. "Tommy's stronger than you'd like to admit," Techno had said, "and smarter than anyone gives him credit for. And if you leave him behind, you will not only use an irreplaceable asset, you will also lose your brother's love. Don't stand there and tell me that Tommy will allow you to fight this war without him. What will you do when he inevitably protests? Lock him in his bedroom? Shackle him to the wall? You tried to protect him once before, and look where that got you." And so Wilbur had taken his brother to the front lines, ordered the tailors to make him a uniform that Wilbur would have killed to never see him wear, and then he'd sent his brother, his baby brother, his Tommy, off to the slaughter. And now he was dead. Dead in the red and blue colors of the family that failed him one last time. "No," the voices hissed. "Not your family." Wilbur met Techno's eyes once more. "This is your fault." And Techno was right, in the end. It was damnably easy for Wilbur to stand, open his arms, and place Tommy down on the cot, before his body had moved on its own, but this time, every action was deliberate. Deliberately, he shrugged off his torn and bloody coat and put it over Tommy, to keep him warm, if warmth was something dead bodies still felt. Deliberately, he tucked a loose strand of Tommy's hair behind his ear. Deliberately, Wilbur let his brother go. Deliberately, he turned and faced Technoblade. Anger, it seemed, was a stronger emotion than sorrow. Technoblade's eyes were gleaming in the flickering candlelight. He still held a wet cloth in his hand, but he clutched it so fiercely Wilbur would not be surprised if it was merely shreds by now. "Be very careful," Techno drawled, "of what you're about to say to me, Wilbur." "You told me to bring him here!" Wilbur flung the accusation like an arrow from a bow, watching it strike its mark. "And you were their target! We're all just collateral fucking damage for all the shit you've done. The past caught up to you, Technoblade. Why the hell did you have to bring us all down with you? Thunder crashed around them like vicious war drums, followed by a flash of lightning that bathed everything in a ghastly glow. Technoblade and Wilbur stared at each other across the flower-strewn gap that grew between them with every word. They were two ghosts in limbo, twin stars, drawn to each other's collapsing gravities. They were going to destroy each other tonight, and Wilbur was going to enjoy every damn minute of it. I told you, Technoblade growled. I told you I would take care of them, didn't I? I could have stopped this at the border, but you wanted to play the peaceful dignitary even when the bloody facts were staring you right in the face. Wilbur remembered that day clearly. The day the first spies' reports had come in, confirming what the voices had been whispering tauntingly for weeks. Wilbur, as always, had called for Technoblade's advice, and Technoblade had read the missives once, looked up, and simply said, I could kill them all. Wilbur had flinched. Techno, that's not... I could. You know I could. Technoblade had leaned over his desk, meeting Wilbur's incredulous stare with hazy eyes. Just say the word. Wilbur had not. They'd argued, like they'd never argued before, like they were arguing now. And Technoblade had left, slamming the doors of Wilbur's office with such force it rattled the books off his shelves. And then, not even a day later, the Green Army had massacred an entire city at the borders. Had Technoblade been right then? Was Technoblade right now? Wilbur found it didn't matter. He didn't care. All he wanted was to rip and tear. His fury would not discriminate. Technoblade. Wilbur shook his head ruefully, always choosing violence at every turn. Technoblade inhaled slowly. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, don't I? Wilbur watched Technoblade's features twist in surprise and grim anticipation, quickly hidden by a veneer of indifference. Did he know it was coming? Did he fear it as much as Wilbur was eager to twist the knife? Tommy didn't know about where you go off to on your little nighttime escapades, but I do, Wilbur finally said, finding a grim sort of delight in the way Techno froze on the spot. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I wouldn't ask questions or follow you? You're an idiot, Wilbur, Techno said, his words nothing less than venomous. Wilbur only smiled in the face of his fury. Did you at least have fun murdering your way through the woodlands, Techno? He'd been 17 when he found out. In truth, he didn't even know how he'd arrived at that forest. It was exactly like the first time he'd ever seen Techno leave, all those years ago, when the raging voices had followed him into the darkness and he'd woken up somewhere with no recollection of who he'd gotten there. But all of his confusion had been quickly replaced with fear as he spotted Techno moving between the trees, stalking after something crawling across the forest floor. Or not something. Someone. Wilbur had pressed himself against the trunk of a tree, his hands clamped over his mouth, barely able to breathe as Techno's prey begged for his life. And then he'd heard the distinct sound of a sword being freed from its scabbard. One scream, then a wet thud. That was all, before Wilbur passed out once more. When he awoke, he was in his own bed at the castle, his heart thudding in his chest, but completely unharmed. He'd taken a deep breath, glad to brush it all off as a nightmare, before he noticed the single green leaf clutched in his right hand. He'd never spoken of it, until now. Go on then, Wilbur said as Technoblade simply stared at him, breathing heavily. Understand. Technoblade's voice sounded strained, like a taut rope one pull away from unraveling. You know the voices. They don't let go. They demand their fill, Wilbur, and sometimes it's unstoppable. But I've been trying so goddamned hard. There it was, the crack. A hairline fracture so slowly fissuring into something more. If you really were following me, you'd know I haven't killed anyone for years before today. I stopped. I fought the voices off, even if it took everything from me. You think you got me pegged, Wilbur? All you needed to define me by was you and Tommy. But go ahead and find other definitions if that will make you happy. Let's see if I still have anything left in me to care. It fell off. That made Wilbur pause, if only for a second. Then where have you been going? Looking for your father, Technoblade spat, and the words fell between them like a dead weight. Wilbur turned towards the man in question, but his father had not moved in ages, stuck sitting with his head in his hands, oblivious to the thunderstorm around him. Not one word, not one move. Of course, he thought bitterly, taking in his father's slumped shoulders and the obsidian wings tucked close around him. Why would I expect anything different? Wilbur wanted to feel angry at him, wanted his vision to go red every time he caught a glimpse of his father's golden hair in his periphery. But he only had his pity. Wilbur had not seen his father in years, but looking at him now, he didn't see the cold, distant king of the past. He only saw a pathetic excuse of a man, someone who'd abandoned his sons, who only returned after the hard decisions had been made, after Wilbur had been forced to make them. He didn't want to spare a single thought more on the laughable sight of his father sitting leagues away from his Tommy's body, not even bothering to meet the eyes of the only son he had left. "That's right," Techno said roughly, catching Wilbur's attention once more. The blood god stood with his fist clenched at his sides, trembling with fury. Wilbur had never seen his eyes so hateful, not even when he was carving his way through the battlefield. Wilbur reveled in it. "I went out, every night, for years, ignoring the voices, ignoring everything, to look for your father, to give him back to you, because I saw you. Every meal you missed, every hour you spent studying politics instead of sleeping, every time you felt like you were choking. I saw it. I was there for it, and it killed me. So I went off to look for someone to help you. I tried telling you I've changed. I only bite when my family's in danger, but you still see me as some sort of rabid dog. And those people I did kill in the forests, they were criminals, Wilbur." As if that changes anything. "Tell that to the army you just blew to smithereens." "You set those explosives!" "And you gave the order. So where does that leave us?" For a moment, they simply stood there, staring at each other, and catching their breaths. The storm still raged outside, but some bit of it was living inside of Wilbur's chest. This was the endgame. Wilbur knew they were standing on a precipice. If one of them jumped now, they were lost to each other forever. And so, Wilbur leapt. "Maybe it was better Tommy died before he found out what you are," he said slowly, deliberately. "You must be happy. At least now he'll never get the chance to know just what sort of monster you truly are." Technoblade moved in a flash. Wilbur had anticipated it, but still couldn't help a gasp of surprise as Techno barreled into him, sending both of them sprawling on the ground. Wilbur's head cracked against the packed earth, but the sting of it was a welcome one. Technoblade kneeled over him, his fist curled around the collar of Wilbur's shirt. Wilbur could feel Technoblade's anger radiating from him like heat from a raging forest fire, but when he looked into his old tutor's eyes, he could only see his own wretched smile reflected back at him. Technoblade pulled one fist back, his entire body trembling. "Go ahead," Wilbur said. "Prove me right." There was a split second where Wilbur thought Technoblade would simply leave, like Wilbur had always known he would eventually, and then his fist collided with Wilbur's face. There was a sickening crunch and lancing pain, and Wilbur knew from the amount of warm blood that dripped down the side of his face that Technoblade had broken his nose. Wilbur leaned back, looking up at Technoblade with wide eyes. Technoblade stared back at him with equal shock, the anger briefly ebbing from his face to reveal a genuine worry. Technoblade began, but Wilbur cut him off with a derisive snort. "That all you got, blood god?" he said, and promptly kicked Technoblade off him. Technoblade went flying and crashed against the cot right behind him. Wilbur's breast caught as he watched his cot tremble, then collapse. "No!" Technoblade reached his arms out, but he wasn't fast enough. Tommy's limp body fell to the floor with a hollow thud. For a moment, all was quiet. There was only the distant rumble of thunder, so far away now, as Technoblade and Wilbur simply stared at Tommy's body lying in the dirt before them, like abandoned refuse, like a toy, once loved, now broken, discarded by a careless toddler's fickle hands. He hated himself for it, but his first instinct was to search the room for his father. He met his father's eyes as the old king slowly rose from his seat, his mouth a thin line of disapproval. "Always disapproval," the voice hissed. "Even now. Especially now." Wilbur wrenched his gaze away from his father's, only to be met with Technoblade's, his pale face a study in grief. "What the hell did we just do?" Technoblade whispered, almost too quiet to be heard over the pounding rain. But Wilbur was already rushing to his feet. Before Technoblade could say another word, Wilbur ran. "Don't." The warning was soft, but brooked no argument. Techno stopped at the edge of the tent where he'd been readying to chase after Wilbur, turning towards the sound of Phil's voice. Philza had gathered Tommy's body into his arms, but he was looking right at Techno. "He needs his space," Phil continued, his blue eyes almost gray in the dim light. How would you know? Techno wanted to say, but his gaze fell and caught on Tommy. What was left of his anger evaporated into mist as he took in the state of his pupil. The blood and mud still on his skin and clothes, the dagger still protruding from his small, unbreathing chest. Phil held the boy with infinite gentleness. Tommy's head nestled against the crook of his arm, Tommy's cheek pressed against his chest, exactly like how one would hold a newborn babe. Techno wondered when the last time Phil had held Tommy like that, if Tommy even allowed him over the age of 3, and realized it did not really matter. A father's arms never forgot the shape of a child. Not that Techno knew anything about being a father, or being a son. Techno nodded begrudgingly at Philza. And we need to clean Tommy. Phil looked down at the body in his arms, his expression cloudy. I suppose we should. They moved quietly, carefully. Techno grabbed the cloth he'd dropped along his tussle with Wilbur and went to wet it in the rain again, lingering in the cold to let the last raindrops wash away the blood on his knuckles. Wilbur's blood. His stomach tightened as the blood-stained water dripped from his hands, but in a few moments, his hands were clean once more. When he turned his back to Tommy and Phil, he found that Phil had taken the knife from Tommy's chest. Is this yours? Phil asked bitterly, running his hand over the nice carved handle. You should know, Techno said. You gave it to me. Phil looked up in surprise. Techno could only shrug, unsure of where they now stood with each other. It was a long time ago, Techno said. You gave me a whole set. During the... Yes, Techno cut him off. During that time. For the first time, Phil seemed to look his age, ancient and weathered by his endless years. Techno could see him remembering it all, their empire of blood and glory, broken only by silent months of warm companionship. It seemed their bodies recalled that just as much as their minds did, because they slipped easily into their grim work, side by side, never needing to speak a single word. As Phil combed the dirt out of Tommy's hair, Techno scrubbed at the stains on his arms and the stubborn one on his cheek. And when Techno's breathing began to slow at the sight of the jagged wound on Tommy's chest, Phil silently worked Tommy out of his torn shirt and into a fresh one that did not bear the scars of their battle. When they stepped back, surveying their work, Tommy was polished. Tommy was spotless. Tommy was dead. Of all the things that could have broken him, Techno didn't understand why it had to be the sight of Tommy actually looking clean. He'd held it together when they were walking back to camp. He'd held it together when Wilbur pinned him with the accusations that simply echoed what the voices had been saying for years. Monster, monster, monster. He'd killed 1,000 men, seen allies eviscerated, and witnessed the fall of kingdoms. He'd seen Philza kneel. He'd seen the world end 100 times over and watched its people rebuild it over and over while he stood back, helpless, wanting to scream at them for being foolish, but also yearning with all his might to be able to love something enough to also love what grew from its ruins. And looking at Tommy's peaceful face was what finally made Technoblade, Emperor of Ice, Blood God, Destroyer of Worlds, cry. He stood over Tommy's body and let the tears fall. He let himself come undone with grief and guilt, misery and madness, and all at once he understood. He understood the anguish in the war god's eyes. He understood the pain of the widows and the orphans he left in his wake. He understood the agony of an entire world brought to its knees before a merciless god. And he felt it all. A hand closed around his trembling shoulder. Techno. Phil's voice was a distant thing. We need to talk. Talk? Techno whirled around, shrugging Phil's hand off his shoulders. The other god simply backed away, giving Techno his space. Techno hit on Phil's face. What is there to talk about? About... Philza swallowed, leaning against the table as if he could not bear his own weight any longer. About why I left. Your son is dead. The words tasted like ash on his tongue. His corpse is right in front of you. Hot tears still stinging his eyes. What? Philza's lips drew into a thin line, a habit Techno recognized from their Empire days as something Philza did when he was trying not to scream. I left for 1,000 different reasons, Techno. When she died, I just knew. Though the pain of losing her was more than I could bear, I knew something worse would come. And it did come, sooner than I expected, but it came. He glanced at Tommy, his expression undecipherable. Her deaths destroyed me, but I knew the day I lost my sons would be the day I destroyed the world. His eyes slid to Techno. You understand that, I think. I do? Technoblade did not want to agree with him on anything, but there was no other explanation for why the voices were slowly getting louder and louder inside his head. He was beginning to lose himself. He already had if he'd hurt Wilbur like that. It had only been a few hours. There was no telling what he could do, what he would become, later. He stared at Philza, for once realizing the Angel of Death might be called that for a reason. We gods are different. Our grief is infinite, but so is our power. Philza looked down at his hands. No being should have both. Grief, an immortal, already does so much fucking damage. In us, it will be 1,000 times worse, so I did the only thing I felt could save me. Save everyone from my grief. Blue eyes found red. Have you heard of the Green God, Technoblade? Techno found himself nodding. The Green God, an infamous force, but a mystery to all. Technoblade had found the name carved into trees older than civilization, and written into the mortals' holy texts. Philza smiled. The Green God could bring him back. The rest of the world fell away, and in its place, hope. That's why. A single tear, the last of its kind, the last Techno could give, fell down Techno's cheek, warm and light. That's why you aren't breaking down right now. Oh, Philza gave him a sad smile. Believe me, my old friend, I am completely losing it. I just had more practice at hiding it than you. Knowing I can revive my son doesn't do shit for the pain of seeing him die in the first place. And your wife? That sobered Philza quickly. I don't know. The texts I read, and there were millions, had conflicting stories of the Green God's rules, what he can and can't do. They all agree he's powerful, even more powerful than you and me combined, I reckon, but he can bring Tommy back, and right now that's the only thing that matters. Techno was quiet for a moment, simply processing the weight of Philza's revelation. Then he said, Couldn't you have said all that before I broke Wilbur's face? Philza grimaced. I'm sorry, I was, well, losing it. As I said, you know me. Techno nodded. I do know you. Always gone in the aftermath, aren't you? Techno. You could have stayed to explain, Techno said quietly, or you could have taken me with you. They both knew he wasn't just talking about Tommy anymore. Philza shook his head sadly. What gave me the strength to leave the night my wife died, Techno, was the knowledge that you were staying behind. I'd seen what you were becoming to the boys, and what the boys were becoming to you. I knew I could leave because they had you. But who did I have, Phil? Techno demanded. Phil's eyes widened. Techno, that's me and you, Techno went on, not hearing anything beyond the pounding of his own heart. That's what you said. So where were you when I was crashing through an entire library's worth of books on history and politics and goddamned etiquette just to fit into a life I never asked for? Where were you when Tommy was waking up from nightmares almost every night, or when Wilbur was pulling his hair out over being a king at 16? Where were you when the voices got so loud for the both of us that we had to take turns reminding each other to breathe? There was a sharp crack, startling both Techno and Philza. They looked down at the table Philza had been leaning on, only to find a chunk of it broken clean off in Philza's hand. Oh. Philza stared uncomprehendingly at the cracked pieces in his hands. That's... He looked helplessly at Techno. What do I do now? For the table? Oh wait, sorry. Technoblade crossed his arms. Apologize for one thing. For the table or for leaving? At Technoblade's unimpressed look, Philza winced. Sorry, that was my awful attempt at humor, I suppose. He took a deep breath, dropping the broken pieces from his hands. I know I have a lot to be sorry for, he began. Techno sighed. Once this is all over, I will never stop trying to make it up to you, but it will have to wait once we're safe. Once we're all home. He glanced pointedly at Tommy, then back at Techno. Like I said, this war isn't over. The Green God is still out there. This was simply his invitation. An invitation? Techno thought about the thousands of corpses, enemy and ally, buried underneath the rubble of exploded mountains. His trident and whip, still slick with blood. What had the war god said? I'm merely a pawn in this game. Is this all a joke to him? Philza nodded tightly. He's more a god than the both of us. You're calling me immortal, Philza? That depends. Philza smiled gently. Do you still think it's an insult? Techno did not reply. Instead, he turned towards the front of the tent, to the rain still raging outside. Someone needs to find Wilbur. Philza found him at the very edge of the hill, kneeling over a cluster of blue flowers, the rain pouring over his shoulders. He seemed numb to the cold, to everything entirely, but when Philza spread his wings over him, keeping the downpour away, his dark eyes flickered to his father, just for a second. Just for a heartbeat. But it was acknowledgement, which was more than Phil could ever hope to deserve. Techno's words echoed in his head, each syllable leaving bleeding wounds that Phil would never show. Techno had already suffered so much, too much. Phil would rather die than add to that. Whatever apology he could come up with now would be meaningless. A small, pathetic scratch against an iceberg of his own making. Actions, after all, spoke louder than if not a man of action. King at 16, Techno had said, as if it was the worst thing to be. Now, looking down at his son, Philza knew it to be true. Wilbur was holding his own hand in his lap. In the dark, Phil could barely make out a jagged, barely healed scar on his palm. He wanted to ask a million things at once. Are you okay? You did that. What happened? Will you ever forgive me? Forgive me, forgive me, forgive me? But he held his silence, even if it was the second most painful thing he had ever done. He waited, and waited. He would wait until the world ended, if that was what it took. And then, eventually, Wilbur spoke. It really was meant to be. I'm sorry? Phil asked gently. Yeah, Wilbur sighed heavily. You should be. Well, why didn't you visit? Wilbur asked suddenly. Overhead, lightning arched across the midnight sky, and Phil finally allowed himself to look, really look at his son. His jaw was sharper, his shoulders broader, but underneath the blood and grime and the haunted eyes, it was still his boy. His Wilbur, terrified of the dark. Or even write a letter! Anything! Phil's heart shattered. Because if I did, if I allowed myself that foot in the door, I knew I wouldn't have had the courage to leave again. And did you ever think of us? Of course, every second of every day. I never thought of you, Wilbur said. Or at least, I tried not to. It was hard. I saw you everywhere. In the paintings, in the garden, down every hallway, in Tommy's eyes, Techno's words. He closed his scarred hand so tightly that the wound opened up once more, spilling blood onto the grass. But what's strange is that I never saw you in me. Thunder echoed over the valley, but Philza barely heard it. I think that's a good thing, Wilbur. No! Wilbur gave a rueful shake of his head. No, it's not. I'm tired of pretending it is. I'm tired of everything. I wish I could be just like you and leave it all behind without looking back. That was enough. Philza went and kneeled before Wilbur, his hands finding Wilbur's shoulders. Wilbur's expression crumpled, and Philza knew it wasn't just rain dripping down his cheeks. Leaving you and Tommy, Philza said, almost killed me, Wilbur, but I knew I had to spare you exactly from this. He shook him slightly, desperately, just to get any sort of emotion behind those cold brown eyes. We can bring him back, Wilbur. This isn't the end. He told Wilbur of his plans, of the years he'd spent hunting down every lead and every whisper of the green god who could rewrite history, rewind death itself. I know, Philza said. I know this doesn't absolve me of the things I've done, leaving you, when your mother had just... I thought I was protecting you from my world, but I should have understood earlier. You are my world. You and Techno and Tommy. And after this, after the green god gives us your brother back, we can go home together, and you can be Prince Wilbur again, if you want. Or we could go somewhere else, find a place nobody knows our names, and just be. For a while, Wilbur was silent again. Speak, Philza begged. Please talk to me. At last, Wilbur said, You know, children don't really care about why their parents leave. They only care that they did. It's a blessing, I suppose, that I never truly was a child, even when I was young. He nodded once, only to himself. And how sure are you that the green god will give us anything, after all he's done? Because I'll make him, the angel of death vowed. Wilbur scoffed. Right. Techno told me about you, you know. Well, I guess you told me about Techno first with your bedtime stories. Every time I pray to the gods, I've only ever been praying to you. I'm not much of a pious man now. Wilbur gave him the ghost of a smile. But I suppose faith is stronger when tested, right? Before Philza could say anything, Wilbur threw his arms around his father, pulling him into an embrace. Philza stilled, a frozen, unmoving statue in his son's arms, and then he cracked. He leaned into Wilbur, his own arms going around Wilbur and pushing him. His own arms going around Wilbur and pulling him close. He still remembered the last time Wilbur had allowed himself to be hugged like this by his father. He was older now, and heavier, but that would never matter. Phil had never forgotten his initial hesitation at holding Tommy. That shame would follow him forever, but after that, he'd promised to hold his sons as long as they would let him, and he had sworn to never be the first one to let go. Phil had spent 9 years, 10 months, 3 days, and 16 hours away from his eldest son. And now, in the rain and the dark where no one could see him cry, Phil's a lot more explaining to do. I know. And when we get Tommy back, you'll have the light. In his left hand was a roll of bandages ready for Wilbur's nose. Wilbur found himself grinning, a quip already on his tongue, but was silenced as Techno crossed into the rain and wrapped Wilbur in his arms. Wilbur sunk wordlessly into the god's embrace, and both of them were finally warm. Forgiveness came easily with brothers, after all. The angel of death looked on quietly. He would not be welcome for this moment, not when there was too much between the three of them still, but he knew someday he would be again. One day, the four of them would be together in a home full of sunlight. Looking forward to that distant time, Philza finally felt peace. Inside the tent, a golden-haired prince slept on. Whew! Oh, we made it. It is now 4:20 p.m. where I live, which is funny to me. Anjay asks, what did you miss? Well, I finished chapter 4, and I just finished chapter 5 of Passerine. So that's what you missed. But yeah, I'm like, okay, I see the computer is glitching, or I see that my stream is glitching and lagging out. So I apologize in advance for that. I hope the audio is not too bad. Oh geez, how long was it doing that? Let's see. My computer's gonna die. Yeah, my computer's going to absolutely have a heart attack, so it's a good time to stop. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll be back again. I'm not sure when I'm going to read the next chapters, but we've got 2 more chapters left, which is exciting. But yeah. Good stuff. 2 more chapters to go. And I think I'm ready for it. Thanks everybody for watching. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Like the video and all that if you're watching on YouTube. Follow on Twitch, all that good stuff. But yeah, good content, man. Man, this fic is so good. I'm excited to read the last 2 chapters. I'll probably get them in one go. But yeah, thanks everybody for watching. Let's see who's streaming so we can raid somebody on Twitch. Let's see. Who's live? Nobody I actually know is live right now. Whoopsies. We could raid. Let's see. Thanks, Anjay. I might stream a little later. We'll see. But yeah. Let's go over to... Thank you for watching, Nye. I appreciate you.